One of the interesting things about the Liberal government, and of course they campaigned on this, was this very clear declaration that they wished Canada to, using the phrase Canada's back, really hearkening back to a tradition of very creative, very active multilateral diplomacy. So Canada working at the UN and on the world stage. I mean, one of the terms that was used was constructive engagement, and also the helpful fixer, the bridger, but basically really focusing on conflict resolution tools, solving problems. And given the state of global problems today, that's an important role. It's not an easy role, and it's one where it's easier perhaps to articulate the principle than it is to be faithful to that principle in practice. A key area that Canada has enunciated is support for a rules-based international order, for international law. And again, that can put Canada or perceived Canadian economic interests in conflict with principles and with international law. And of course, the example that would come to mind would be our military exports to Saudi Arabia, when the country is stands accused by the UN of war crimes, very, very, very serious transgressions of international law. So I would argue that Canadian jobs must never depend on the abuse of human rights of others abroad. The government has a duty to find a way out of that. But it is a good example of how promoting a multilateral, a fair, global multilateral order that delivers for all, is easier said than done.
As a middle power, I think Canada doesn't necessarily bring the same capabilities that some of the larger countries bring to international affairs and international cooperation. At the same time, we do bring meaningful capabilities. So our role, I think, is to ensure that those capabilities are as strong and as well developed as they possibly could and can be. Those involve significant investments in our diplomacy, our defense, and our development capabilities. But then Canada also has to bring ideas to the table within international affairs. We need discussions and debate of foreign policy in Canada, as the types of discussions that are brought through iAffairs, I think, are well suited to that. But Canada needs to bring ideas to build networks among different players, to connect major actors like the United States with other middle powers, but also with other global players. And by playing that pivotal role and positioning ourselves at the center of networks, Canada is able to be a constructive and productive player within international institutions and global diplomacy.
I have real difficulty with that whole notion of middle power behavior. There was a time when Canada could reasonably call itself a middle power. In other words, a country whose foreign policy was designed essentially to try and affect the nature of the international system. Today, unfortunately, middle power as an idea it tends to be misused and tends to essentially describe or try and describe a country that engages in the kind of diplomacy that no longer is out there, given what's happening in the international system and the return of great power politics.
Sometimes I think that's the wrong question that we're asking ourselves. The real question we should be asking ourselves are, what are Canada's interests in the world? And how do we most effectively promote them? When it comes to our economic interests, as I've said, trade diversification. When it comes to our security partnerships, particularly transatlantic partnerships, but also now trans-Pacific partnerships with key democracies in the region. How do we invest in those partnerships to promote global security at a time of not only growing geopolitical tensions and rivalries that have profound implications for global order and stability, but also non-traditional threats, terrorism, cyber threats. And those cyber threats also now extend into our economy. It's not just theft of intellectual property, but the vulnerability of critical infrastructure. Those are going to require real and substantial, not only political commitments, but also investments of real resources. And that's going to take leadership, particularly from the new government that will assume power later this month.